whenever.
I'm still getting over the fact that this is a church where you talk about farting. Turn back to 2 Kings 13, please, friends. And let me just come out and say, some passages in the Bible are just really weird. Have a look. A dying prophet gets a king to shoot arrows out of a window to secure military victory. A dead man gets thrown into a dead prophet's grave and then comes back to life, and we're kind of meant to make some sense of all this. If you've been dragged to church by a friend tonight against your will, I now give you permission to turn to them, dig them in the ribs and say, I told you this was a waste of time. Like, what are we meant to do with this? Let me give you the headline. You won't believe me just yet, but I'll give it to you anyway. Here it is. God is far more patient, powerful, and compassionate than we could ever imagine or deserve. God is far more patient, powerful, and compassionate than we could ever imagine or deserve. Before we kind of make sense of that, come back to 2 Kings 13. Have a look at the context from the beginning of the chapter. You can see straight away that we've moved from Judah, where we were last week in chapters 11 and 12. We've come back to the northern kingdom of Israel. And we see straight away the familiar dark side of this nation. A new king, and the familiar cry goes out, verse 2, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This time, though, the theological problem has a number of other consequences. So if you skip down to verse 7, you'll see that Israel's army are falling into disrepair. There's only 50 horsemen left, 10 chariots, and 10,000 footmen. Why? The king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like the dust at thrashing. A new king, verse 10, and the familiar pattern continues. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Things are not good in Israel. Israel and her kings are running further and further from God, and its army are weaker and weaker. There are raids increasing from the surrounding country. This is a million miles from the prosperity and peace of Solomon's rule. And yet, look at the first point. The patience of God trumps human frailty. The patience of God trumps human frailty, which is, again, hard to believe. Verse 14, we see an even bigger problem as our passage begins. Elisha has fallen sick. Elisha, the very prophet of God, is on his deathbed. And the king, who is a rebel and hates God, or is so desperate, he comes to the king and says, verse 14, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. He breaks down next to the prophet, desperate because his army is rubbish, and so he comes to the one who is the army of Israel, who is the one-man army who can actually look after Israel. Israel's king doesn't know much, but he knows that without Elisha, Israel is vulnerable. And as we read along, king after king after king, evil king after evil king after evil king, we're asking the question, has God given up? Is this the end of God's word to Israel? Will God now go silent? That would be reasonable. Decades of kings had rejected God's word. Maybe Israel's time is up. But remember the point. The patience of God trumps human frailty. God's ways are not our ways. What does Elisha do? Incredibly, look there, he gives the king a promise, this kind of hopeful promise in the form of a visual aid. He gets him to shoot an arrow out of the window. End of verse 17. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have made an end of them. God will give you victory. That's the promise. The Syrians are as good as toast. God will rescue you. Let me say, it's a bit hard to get the gist of this little visual aid. We can get confused between the command to shoot an arrow and the command to strike the ground. Okay? Think of them as one command. You shoot an arrow, and then the arrow eventually hits the ground. Okay? It's one visual aid, it's one command. Elijah's essentially saying, for every arrow you shoot out of the window, for every arrow that hits the ground, that will represent another victory over Syria. To a king who does evil, this is an incredible promise. To a king without an army, it's almost unbelievable. But the patience of God trumps human frailty. Which makes what happens next utterly idiotic. Look down there again at the end of verse 18, the last two words. Which hit us with the thud like an arrow hitting the ground. He stopped. The king thought, nah. 3 arrows, that's enough. We don't know whether he got bored. Maybe he didn't believe the prophet. There's just so many questions as you read through this, we're not told. What we are told is Elisha's reaction. You see, he's angry. For good reason. He'd given the king a golden ticket to success. And the king had kind of cashed in this golden ticket for the military equivalent of 3 mini Mars bars. So he says, 3 strikes and you're out. This great promise of victory over Syria is now reduced to 3 victories in battle. You will win 3 battles, but you won't win the war. But again, none of this could be anticipated by the king. He flung himself at this dying prophet in the hope of mercy and still received it. He didn't deserve any of this. God is far more patient than we can ever imagine or deserve. I keep meeting people who tell me that they're too far gone to come to God. They say, look, if you knew the things I'd done, if you knew the regrets I had, the mess I've made of people in my life, you know that God is not for me. If that's something you're thinking, look at this king. The king who really did not deserve mercy, a king who was bent on rebelling against God all his life. Whatever you've done, you're not outside the mercy of God. A little bit later in the service, Marcelo will lead us in a prayer of confession. It's a prayer we're all going to pray. There's things that all of us regret, are ashamed of. But perhaps for you tonight is an opportunity to recognize, even for the first time, that God's mercy is for you. Of course, many of us know too well the patience of God. My question, I think, is this. Why, like the king, are we so often half-hearted? We don't, send arrows out of windows, but we quickly give up. Many of us, I think, are much like a pilot in an aeroplane. You know the deal. All the energy of a pilot goes into the takeoff. As soon as you hit 30,000 feet, you pretty much coast. Automate all the controls, put your feet up, read the paper. It's easy. I think for many of us, that kind of describes our Christian life. For the first year or two, we're kind of gung-ho and it's all on. But then it stops. Or we just coast. Jesus warned his disciples about this in Luke chapter 8. He said, look, think of it like four soils. As the word goes out, people will respond in different ways. Some people will give up straight away. Others will be distracted by the cares and worries and riches and pleasures of life. Don't be like that, Jesus says. Be like the good soil. Luke 8, verse 15. They are those who, hearing the word, hold it fast in an honest and good heart and bear fruit with patience. It might be worth chatting. It'll take some vulnerability, but it might be worth chatting over supper. What would tempt you to stop bearing fruit? What would stop you resolving to patiently serve God? Point 2. The power of God triumphs over death. The power of God triumphs over death. As you come down to the next section, we see the inevitable thing happens. The prophet Elisha dies. And moving right along, we come to something else. No, what do you mean? Back with Elijah, when he ascended to heaven, there was fanfare, there was a whirlwind, there was all sorts of stuff going on. How can we kind of just move on from the death of Elisha? Well, because there's a connection between what happens next. Look at verse 21. And as a man was being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. I suspect most of us have been to funerals, but probably not a funeral like this. There's a funeral going on, and out of the corner of their eye, the people see another raiding party from Syria coming over the hill. Stop the funeral, ditch the guy's body into an open grave, and scatter. It'd be interesting. It's strange. But with the death of Elisha, we're asking the question, is this the end? Has God tired of Israel's rebellion? In 4 chapters' time, we'll see Israel taken away by the Assyrian army. With Elisha dead, with the exile upon us, is this the end for Israel? See, what happens in this little story changes our perspective entirely. Verse 21, as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. This is both utterly weird and profoundly comforting. This is not the end of Israel. Much like the visual aid with the bow and arrow, God has not forgotten his promises to Israel. The death of Elisha isn't the end of hope. God hasn't forgotten his promises. God hasn't left Israel for dead. But what about us? We're not in Israel. We're not unrepentant calf worshippers. We're not exiles in Assyria. But whether we like it or not, and whether we talk about it or not, death is a door that we all must walk through. Praise be to God who says that death is not the end. Praise be to God who triumphs by his power over death. See, death will not have the last word on Israel. The prophet Ezekiel, hundreds of years later, finds himself in this valley of dry bones. It's depressing, but go with it for a moment. Listen to what God promised to him in Ezekiel 37. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. I will bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you. And you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. What a promise. What a vision of hope. The death of this prophet, Elisha, will not be the end. Death itself will not be the end. This precious hope that our brother Adnan is holding on to. Remember what happened after Jesus died on the cross? There's this strange little incident that you probably scratched your head and wondered about in Matthew 27. Have a look at the end of Jesus' life. Jesus cried aloud with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtains of the temple were torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who were fallen asleep were raised. Coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Again, it would just be weird. Uncle Bob comes walking down the street. Hey, how you going? The death of Jesus means that death is not the end for us, because death doesn't hold him down. Death is only the beginning for his people. The power of God triumphs over death itself. There's a phrase that we need to get used to using around here. Most of us are too scared to use these three words, but I'm just going to put it out there. I need help. We live in a world where you have to be stronger and more self-reliant and more resilient than sometimes you think you can do. There is a limit. There has to be a time when we say, I need help. Let me say, this church has got to be a place where we can say, I need help. You particularly need to say these words when it comes to the question of death. Without God's life-giving power, death remains your biggest enemy. The only hope you have to pass through that door with any confidence is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Finally, point 3, the compassion of God trounces human folly. I understand that the word compassion doesn't start with a P. I'm sorry. I've been searching thesauruses all week. The best I can do is say, please put the emphasis on the passion in compassion, and hopefully that'll help you sleep at night. So the compassion of God trounces human folly. Here we go. The final section, quite quickly, from verse 22, really fulfills the actions the king took earlier on. Just as he shot 3 arrows out of the window, so 3 times the Syrian army are defeated in verse 25. But there's just this annoying verse in this section. Annoying, but profoundly transformational. Verse 23. The Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them. He turned toward them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This passage has been tricky to work through this week. There's so many points I want more information, another verse, another explanation. And yet when I come to the final section, there's an extra verse that I think is necessary. This verse just kind of sits there and I go, what do I do with it? It actually makes everything clear. Sure, God did keep his promise to Joash, but something far more significant is going on here. Israel didn't deserve God to do any of this. They didn't deserve victory over Syria. They have been rebelling against the God who saved them all the way since 1 Kings chapter 12. Year after year, chapter after chapter, what was God like? He was gracious, he had compassion, he kept turning towards Israel. For 135 years, God had been nothing but compassionate. Why? Because he made promises. Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 26, Genesis 28, and all the way through the Old Testament. When all hope should be gone, it's not. When Israel rejected him again and again and again, God kept loving them and turning towards them. Now, at some point, judgment would come on Israel. God is the just judge after all. A day is coming when God's judgment will come finally and fully. It will be a day when there will be great regret and excuses and what ifs and you should have told us and so on. It'll be awful for those who don't know the compassion of God. But for the moment, we have this incredible picture of a God whose compassion overwhelms our human folly. Has anyone heard about the Darwin Awards? Tom's smiling. Yeah, they're really dumb. They're really awful. So basically, it's a celebration of people who die doing dumb things. Okay, you'll lose about 7 hours tonight looking at all. There's a rabbit hole you can go down. We hear about dumb things that people do and we laugh. That's the idea. Notice how God reacts to our stupidity, our folly, our stupidity. He doesn't laugh. He consistently turns towards us with patience, with power, with compassion. I'm not sure how much you've heard in the media this week. There's been plenty about Christians, actually. Christians being schismatic and judgmental and unloving. If any of that is true, we failed to reflect the God we serve. This God of patience, of power and compassion. I'm going to lead us in prayer from our Puritan friends. Why don't you bow your heads and we'll pray. O Lord, I'm astonished at the difference between my receivings and my deservings, between the state I am now in and my past gracelessness, between the heaven I am bound for and the hell I merit. Who made me differ but you? I was no more ready to receive Christ than were others. I could not have begun to love thee hadst thou not first loved me, or been willing unless thou hadst first made me so. Oh, that such a crown should fit the head of such a sinner, such high advancement before an unfaithful person, such joys for so vile a rebel. Let wrath deserved be written on the door of hell, but the free gift of grace on the gate of heaven. Amen.
please stand as we sing together.